Good morning, afternoon, and evening around the world. I'm so glad that you took some time out of your Saturday to be with us today. Welcome. I'm glad that you're a part of our resident RSA community. And we're delighted to be talking about SMILE today with Dr. Dan Reinstein. This is the 8th webinar in the RSA resident series. It's been an overwhelmingly appreciated webinar, and we're really grateful to be able to offer this to you. This is going to be a wonderful talk today. Within this webinar series, keep in mind that if you participate in all of the different lectures and finish this assessment at the end, that you will be eligible to receive a certificate from the College of Refractive Surgery at the end. So be on the lookout for the assessment. A little bit about the refractive surgery resident series. It came about really by request of one of our resident members, Dr. Brent Kramer. And he noticed and called out to the community saying that we need more education. We need to know the foundations of what's happening in refractive surgery before we get out into practice and before we start our fellowships. And there was an immediate outreach from the RSA community to fill that need. And this is the result of that. So I'm glad that you're here. It's just wonderful content month over month. It adds on itself to really create a nice foundation of the understanding, the underlying principles of refractive surgery and set you up for success in your careers. An important differentiating fact about the RSA is that it's entirely self-funded. So just from the contributions of the physicians that are involved, that's how all of our content is produced. So there's no influence from industry sponsorships and grants. No one will tell our speakers what to say. Everything is based purely on science, outcomes, and experience. And I think that that's very valuable because it allows you to have another layer of trust in what you're hearing. And also be aware of that and be looking for it with the other sources of information that you find in the world, a new way to evaluate your information. So with that, all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Guy Kazarian, who will introduce our speaker. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's wonderful to be here today with everyone. Guy Kazarian, founder of the RSA, and so pleased about the way this has worked out. We have over 800 residents participating in this series, and some of the real giants of ophthalmology delivering the series, delivering the content. Today is no different with Dan Reinstein. Daniel Zoltan Reinstein is the founder and medical director of the London Vision Clinic, one of the premier ophthalmology clinics in the world. He is the doctor to not only ophthalmologists, but to celebrities, to complications, and interestingly, to pretty much all of the jazz professional musicians. Dan's an incredible saxophonist. He spent time at the Berklee School of Music and is a performing saxophonist. And his network of jazz musicians is probably parallel to his network of ophthalmologists. So he really lives in two worlds and is a fascinating individual. You're about to experience one of the best teachers I've experienced in ophthalmology. Dan Reinstein is articulate to a point that I aspire to achieve. He explains things well, he's clear, he's concise, and he points out things that sometimes we skip over. So you're going to have a treat with that. Dan's work, his whole career has been a force of vision. He began in New York many years ago and saw the need to begin to understand epithelium, corneal epithelium, which does so much remodeling and smoothing and fixing the cornea, and realized we had no way to image it. So he developed the technology to image it. He led that whole process. It's now become a standard part of what we do in ophthalmology. That's Dan Reinstein. He invented corneal imaging for epithelium. His work extended beyond that with corneal imaging. His very high frequency ultrasound work of the anterior segment has been revolutionary. Micron level precision that is leading now to changing how we size ICLs and other things. His work with Zeiss over the years, guiding Zeiss's R&D and helping them with working on corneal refractive issues, particularly around SMILE, which he's been very much an architect of, the whole SMILE rollout, the whole SMILE development, which, let me tell you, wasn't easy. It was a big deal to get lasers to be able to do SMILE, to get femtosecond lasers able to make the correction accurate enough to be at par or even better sometimes than what we do with our other procedures. So that was a big heavy lift. And his work with just using optics to help with presbyopia, with his Presbeyond work on using spherical aberration and corneal ablations and treatments to allow for increased depth of focus on the cornea, leaving a perfectly clear lens, perfectly clear and intact, and giving people the ability to see with presbyopia is also revolutionary. So I obviously have great admiration for Dan, great respect and affection for Dan, and so I don't want to take any more airtime, but I do want you to understand just what a treat this is that you have today to listen to him. And with no more ado, let me turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dan Reinstein.
All right, well, Guy, that was extremely generous of you. And, you know, may I add that, you know, actually, there are very few things that I would rather be doing on a Saturday afternoon, very few, than lecturing to RSA members, particularly over the pond in the US, but abroad as well, as the RSA is expanding internationally. And you know, congratulations to Lisa. I don't know if anybody knows, but she's taking over the presidency of the RSA, and I just learned that this morning, and I'm delighted for that because Lisa, you put in a lot of effort into education, and that's, you know, getting into this new generation of ophthalmologists, as far as I'm concerned, is the way to make our specialty change in the right direction. Not that it's been going in the wrong direction, but just to make sure it carries on going in the right direction. So what I've been asked to talk about today is SMILE. And let me just share the screen here so that I can pop my slides up. So the challenge for me, as probably as Guy kind of alluded to just now, and which I, you know, have spent some time crafting this lecture on, was that I'm talking to residents, and I cannot tell you how many emails I got from Lisa and Brett. You know, Dan, you do realize this is a lecture for residents. This is not, you've got to be, you know. So anyway, to the point where I refused to have a 1-hour conference call about it before the meeting. So they haven't seen this lecture yet. I just hope I got it right the first time. What I've decided to do is to talk to you about SMILE in the way that I think is most relevant to you as residents or fellows, because quite frankly, SMILE is a postgraduate subject. It may be like phaco became is now the entry point to cataract surgery. It may be something like that in the medium to far future, but currently there are just so many other aspects to refractive surgery that you need to know and your access to SMILE will probably be relatively limited, at least for the next few years. So I just thought I better make sure you know everything you need to know about SMILE, but I thought it would be a great a bookmark to get myself into other chapters about refractive surgery. And I know you've had a lot of lectures on refractive surgery. I've chosen some things which, you know, Guy implied actually, which tend to be things that get overlooked and not talked about a lot and expected for you to learn, you know, as you go along by osmosis. And I just want to point out that, you know, not that I think I get like $10 every time somebody buys this book, but the way that I wrote this textbook was along the guidelines set by two textbooks, which I'm sure you're going to use. Well, one that you're definitely going to use, and that's David Chang's phacoemulsification book, where, you know, we go into extraordinary and exhaustive detail on videos. He just, I mean, it's beautiful. He just sits there and narrates a video, excruciating detail. And that's a great way to learn. And we've got 16 and a half hours of that kind of stuff here in this textbook, thanks to that example set. But I really wrote the book around the concept of George Waring's original textbook on radial keratotomy, which is back in my bookcase over there. It's that thick, and it was just about radial keratotomy, but that was only the middle bit of the book. He wrote the book explaining everything from marketing to, you know, patient assessment, how to refract, optics, you know, obviously how to do a procedure, post-op complications. So essentially, if the world came to a place where the SMILE was the only refractive surgical procedure, you would only need this book because it has everything you need to know and what your nurses need to know and what your optometrists need to know. So there are chapters here that are particularly, you know, written just for the nurses in the OR, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to just couch what I'm going to do and talk to you about over the next hour or so in that way. And obviously my financial interests and disclosures are that, as Guy mentioned, I've been Zeiss's lead consultant in refractive surgery for 20 years. It's given me the opportunity to greatly influence the pathways that they've taken and the products that they develop and the shape of them, but also how those products are perceived and developed. My involvement in SMILE, I'm going to be very clear. I was totally against SMILE. Certainly when it was first conceived and it was discussed with me in the early 2000s, myself and many others at Zeiss were like, that's crazy. You're never going to get the precision out of a femtosecond laser that you get with an excimer. And then the early work, which I did, I deliberately missed out on. I was not part of that. And you know, my hat goes off to Walter Segundo and Rupal Shah and those people who really pulled some stops out, kind of early microkeratome-based style balls. I got into it really much later. I started when the procedure was not quite as good as LASIK, but good enough for me to get into doing very high myopia, because I understood biomechanically why that was going to be an advantage for patients. So that's when I started, and that was 2011. I did my first procedures. But at that point, I, you know, got into it and I really took a deep dive. And as Guy says, I was, you know, quite instrumental, if I say so myself, in bringing it to a procedure which is now equal to LASIK in most respects and with some advantages, which we may choose over LASIK or PRK, you know, to offer patients. Now, that is, I want to be very clear at the beginning of a SMILE lecture, there is nothing wrong with LASIK. There is nothing wrong with PRK. They are both fantastic procedures, and they still have their place, and they still constitute 25% of all myopic patients that I treat, because sometimes LASIK is better than SMILE. So it's not that the world is going to convert to SMILE. Every company tells you that their procedure is the best procedure for all eyes, and none of them are right. It's a question of being an expert and knowing how to choose the right procedure. And as I've said, you know, these procedures now encompass probably close to 60 million eyes performed worldwide. And, you know, if you look at the highest standard of practice for any of these three procedures, the outcomes are basically the same. The safety is basically the same. And what we're talking about here is giving patients options which might provide certain advantages if all things are equal, or if there can literally be an advantage to having SMILE as opposed to LASIK or PRK. And, you know, this analogy of, you know, expensive sports cars is a good one, because these are not ordinary cars. They're hand-built, and, you know, they're sophisticated. You know, LASIK today is not what LASIK was 10 years ago, and it's certainly not what LASIK was 20 years ago. You know, so anyway, that's just the sort of preamble. Now, I do have a prejudice against PRK. I think it's an excellent procedure, but I only use it therapeutically. I only use it if I can't do lamellar surgery. And what I mean is LASIK or SMILE. I think PRK is not the kind of procedure that a patient wishes they would have. It's certainly it's a procedure that a surgeon would like everyone to have, because it involves a lot less surgical skill and stress if you're not trained. But from a patient standpoint, it's not a great procedure. And I do use it, and it gives great results, but it has very slow visual recovery and all of those disadvantages. But I use it if I must. So basement membrane dystrophy, that I can kill two birds with one stone, and the refractive error. Anterior corneal pathology, scars, contact lens infections that have rendered the center of the cornea with a loss of best spectacle correction. You can whack out the -5 and the scar in the middle of the visual axis at the same time. So there are reasons to use PRK for me, but they are not to do with biomechanics and all that, because we can get into that once I start talking to. So when I talk to patients about refractive surgery, I don't talk about procedures. I educate them about all the procedures, but I make it very clear that I'm going to decide what procedure they're going to have. And one of the things that makes that easy in my practice is that from the beginning, I never had differential costing, differential pricing. So PRK, LASIK, SMILE, whatever procedure you're going to have, it costs the same. And and by taking that element out of the discussion, it kind of takes the weight of perceived bias from the patient standpoint in your choice of procedure. A lot of people are starting SMILE and they're offering it at a premium, and they're justifying it by saying, well, the contact glass disposable is more expensive. Well, you can justify it anyway, but if you start doing that, then you're giving patients the option of having LASIK when SMILE would have technically been better for them because of a cost savings, and it's your eyes. So this is the one thing where you just are not going to try and save that money. The differential, the $1,000, whatever it's going to be, the difference is just not a consideration when you're talking about operating on your eyes. So I want to include a bit of this kind of refractive surgical philosophy. As I said, I'm going to try and meander around refractive surgical topics. And so whether we do LASIK by applying the excimer laser or just SMILE by staying under a femtosecond laser is the choice of the surgeon based on his expertise. Now, some of the things that have made femtosecond lenticle extraction a reality are to do with expertise in optics. And it's not surprising that Zeiss, being the preeminent optical physicist conglomerate of the planet, are the ones who managed to do this. And it's not for want, because other companies, I remember when I was in New York, Mark Speaker showing cat corneas being corrected with a picosecond laser. Everyone's tried this, solid state lasers to remove tissue from the cornea. But Zeiss were only the first ones who were able to produce a system that was able to use a femtosecond laser with a small enough impact bubble that it could very, very precisely make cuts in the cornea, actually submicronic precision. And the reproducibility of the VisuMax was first tested by me using high-frequency ultrasound because it's the most accurate way of doing it. And I published this study for them in 2007. We had got the first laser, and many years later, we published several studies repeating the fact that the standard deviation of the mean of an intended cut is 4 microns. And that's how tight the scatter is. So second aspects were the fact that because the suction that has to be applied to the eye is so minimal, the patients are very comfortable under this laser, even just for making flaps. So rather than, for example, well, I'm going to say any of the other devices in the world that are making flaps, with a femtosecond laser, they increase the pressure in the eye to about 200 millimeters of mercury. This one only goes to about 50, which is not even as much as rubbing your eye. And that's because of the curved contact glass and the sort of ratio of the area and suction applied through these ports along the side. So the patient basically doesn't even know the thing is on their eye when they're being treated. And this is my eye after coming off, and you can see that, you know, the suction ports are basically riding along, but along the limbus. So partially on the conjunctiva, partially on the cornea, and that's how the suction is achieved to immobilize the eye. Obviously, you have to immobilize the eye if you're making micronic cuts in the cornea with an optical interface. You can't have eye movements. Here is the study that Walter Segundo and his group published when the VisuMax was operating at 200 kilohertz. You can see that the pressure response is much, much lower for the VisuMax than any of the other devices that have to apply much higher suction. And with 500 kilohertz, that time point goes down to, you know, less than 30 seconds basically for a flap. So what is SMILE? Well, SMILE is keratomolysis. So, you know, I get very upset when people say, you know, X and Y invented SMILE. It's like, no, they didn't. Barraquer, Jose Ignacio Barraquer, he invented SMILE. And if you look in his 1980 textbook, I should have put that capture here, there is a diagrams of what's called a stromectomy. And the concept is that you will cut an interface, which is called the lenticule interface. That's the power cut, which is not parallel to the surface. And then you will cut a side cut, and then you will make a parallel cut. And so what that does is it creates a lens of tissue, which then will be removed through a small incision. And that is done at a specific depth. And, you know, in the US, you have to make a 4 millimeter incision superiorly. Outside of the US, you can make, well, the minimum of 2 millimeter incision. You can make 1, 2, or 3 of these, and you can place them anywhere you want. The standard protocol, which, you know, I worked on and which is now published in our textbook and which has now become the standard, is to make 2 small incisions of 2 millimeters. So the US 1 4 millimeter incision is kind of the same in terms of cutting, but yeah, details of that to be you know, like down here is the link to our course. And if you want to really learn about SMILE, then you'll take a 2-day course on how to do this. But we go through all these details in painstaking miniaturization. The US treatment range, there are some limitations on the optical zone size. The minimum thickness that could be set for the lenticule has an impact on low myopia treatments and high myopia treatments. And so, you know, it's fixed in the US, it's variable. We can go down to 3 millimeters, 3 microns actually. And then the cap diameters are not limited to 8. Actually, we can make larger cap diameters outside, but we can make cap thicknesses that are, you know, all, you know, over a wide range, which is fixed in the US. And like I said, the incisions are restricted, and we can make a main incision and a reserve incision that doesn't have to be opened. So the US, tiny bit behind because of the way that FDA looks at approvals, and that's a whole other lecture. Guy is the best person to talk to you about this. I always feel better after I talk to him about it. But the US FDA is just doesn't have a good way of extrapolating between obvious points, and it's just the way they do things. And it's sad because it restricts the hands of some of the best trained surgeons in the world. So let me digress for a moment here onto another pet topic of mine, which is, you know, what is a refractive surgeon and how is that different from any other form of surgeon or eye surgeon, even any other form of eye surgeon? Well, the refractive surgeon is a very particular confluence of unlikely to be found aspects in the same person. Because the thing about refractive surgery is that it's engineering. And the thing about engineering is that it's about precision, and precision is about repeatability, and repeatability is about mechanistic, repetition. And so repetition is something that the mind of the refractive surgeon, the personality of the refractive surgeon, has to be not only okay with, but you kind of have to like it. And you kind of have to like repeating the same thing over and over again perfectly without deviation. And if you think about it, that is not a common feature of medical doctors. What attracts people to medicine is variety and the intrigue of the diagnostic process. This is not the same as, working in a factory, assembling one piece at the same time, at the same way every time, like in a Ford factory on a production line. But sadly, I guess you have to realize that if you want to be a great refractive surgeon, you have to enjoy repetition. So what do I mean by repetition? Well, in French, when you say répétition, you mean rehearsal. And another way of looking at it is you think about a classical musician, not a jazz musician, right? Because a classical musician must play the exact notes of that piece, must. If you are a cellist and you're playing a concerto and you change one note because you prefer that note in that place because it's your choice, the audience who comes to hear you, the reviews will be scathing the next day, and the purists will crucify that cellist for changing a note. The classical musician enjoys the perfect repetition, and that is effectively one of the cornerstones of being a refractive surgeon. Is you have to, frankly, enjoy doing it perfectly every time. The second aspect is the one that doesn't always come, or rarely, or not, or very infrequently comes attached to somebody who loves repetition. And that is, you also have to welcome change. So if someone's really good at repeating the same thing and just crochet, and you just crochet all day, you're doing that same old thing, and at the end you got a scarf and it just feels so good. You just did the same thing over and over again. And then suddenly something's different. It's like, okay, someone moved my cheese. Now, the refractive surgeon does not react to change the way that the average person who loves repetition should be reacting. If something is odd, the refractive surgeon welcomes it. In fact, it kind of gives you a little bit of a like, ooh, that's different. We're going to have some fun now. Not exactly what you'll say out loud with the patient lying on the bed awake, but it is what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, that's a challenge. Ha, I've never seen that before. Let me think. And that brings us to the third pillar of the refractive surgeon, which is that you can't be someone who doesn't operate well under stress. And you will see throughout your training and residency, I certainly did, there are surgeons who, when something goes wrong, there's a complication, something's not routine, they get very stressed. Their hands start shaking, they start sweating beads, they get angry, they might throw an instrument across the room, they'll blame the nurse, they'll lose it in the OR a little bit. And that is not part of the ideal refractive surgeon's personality. You have to be someone who can see something horrific happening in front of you. And, you know, those of us who used microkeratomes, we were there. And then you have to just be like, okay. And you have to be able to continue talking to the patient without not even an inflection in your voice, staying nice and calm, speaking absolutely the same tone of voice. And we're just going to take a little bit longer here. Just keep looking at the light. And inside, you're going, ah! But outside, you're going, Yeah, so just, this is going to take a little bit longer. So I just need you to just keep looking at That's my point, is that you have to have this split personality. You have to have an Oscar in film acting, because you have to be able to dissociate whatever it is you're feeling with what you're telling the patient and how you're managing the patient's anxiety, so that they can cooperate with you. They detect even an inkling of stress in your voice, and it's almost game over at that point, because then their confidence in you goes down, and that can really harm a lot of stuff. So that's essentially a little diversion there, which I kind of enjoy going through. And as if I haven't been on my soapbox long enough, I'm going to really do a bit of a deep dive into the importance of standardization. And for me, if this was the only thing I talked about today, you'd know everything you have to know about SMILE, and about cataract surgery, and about strabismus surgery, and everything. And I had one of my residency teachers at Mount Sinai was Ed Rabb. He was one of the original fathers of strabismus surgery, he's trained with Parks, and Ed was he beat the hell out of me in the OR because I didn't put this instrument over here at this way at that angle. It was to that level, and it hurt at the time when he was doing that. But I absorbed those punches, and they made me into a completely different surgeon in every other aspect of ophthalmology that I ever did. So the beautiful fact is that some people have already done all the work for us in justifying and demonstrating and giving evidence for standardization being key. And that's the airline industry. If you look at airline industry records of accidents, fatal accidents, from 50 years ago, it was an order or two orders of magnitude higher than the level of safety of danger that flying has today. I believe last year or the year before was the first year in the history of aviation where there was not one single fatal airline accident in 12 months, in a period of 12 months, not one. And when you think about the fact that the number of flights has grown exponentially in the last 50 years, with millions of flights a day, that is a big feather in their cap. And it's happened because of the way they organized risk, and they organized what is called crew resource management and checklists. And checklists have come into medicine. Some of you are probably young enough that you all read this book before your interviews for medical school. My son certainly did. He's starting at UCL in September. But this concept, trust me, in the 1990s when I was an ophthalmology resident, this wasn't even on the menu, talking about checklists. Everybody had their own way. In the OR, every attending, the nurses had to adapt to everything being different. Different this, different that. He likes that suture, she likes that. It was really complicated for nurses to maintain everyone's individual standards at what they thought it should be. And in this crew resource management concept, there are two aspects which I think are interesting to look at from as surgeons. The second one, the first one is coming up. The second one is this concept of followership. And as you can see, the business world is looking to these concepts as well. This is from the Harvard Business Review. And it explains followership in that in an organization that is functioning at its optimal level, of course there's a leader and a decider. Someone has to be the decider. You can't have two captains on a frigate, but everyone below that captain, the number 2, the number 3, the 4 number 4s, the 6 number 5s, the 22 number 6s, that hierarchy, they have to possess followership. And followership is where no matter what position you are in, you consider your position to be as important a function as that of the leader. And so you take maximum ownership, maximum pride in performing your role without a feeling of looking for the word, resentment for the hierarchy structure above you. I think that's really that's the concept. And if we just talk about this hierarchy and what's called in CRM the hierarchy security, this is a now very commonly talked about issue in medicine, but it wasn't many years ago. The way that this is to do with the ability of a subordinate to speak up in a situation where the subordinate feels that something that the chief or that the captain decided to do that might not be the best option. And so in this hierarchy, the subordinate has to be comfortable with speaking up to a superior about a potential error, like a nurse in an OR pointing something out to the anesthetist. In this hierarchy structure, the superior has to be open to the subordinate to pointing out that there could be a potential error. The pair at that point needs to acknowledge, okay, we are disagreeing here. You know, well, the captain might say, you're right, and switch. But, you know, there may be people who want to say, do you think so? And of course, that's the acknowledgement point. But of course, the decision has to be made by the superior because that's the structure of the hierarchy. You cannot have two captains on one ship. So in this situation, the supervisor needs to understand that the questioning of their authority is not necessarily a threat. But conversely, the subordinate needs to understand that it could easily be perceived as a threat if they question the superior. And therefore, the education of the subordinate is that they must be able to say something in a way that, you know, is unlikely to put the superior's back up. And so there's a psychological component to the subordinate's way of asking questions. And it brings us to errors. And one of the things that Matthew Syed talked about in this Black Box Thinking book, where his wife died due to the lack of a subordinate speaking up to the anesthetist, and she died of asphyxiation in a horrific scene in chapter 1. He basically took an interest in how medicine works and how medicine, how the culture in medicine has evolved to a point where errors are often just swept under the carpet. Hopefully no one noticed and everything carries on the same way. And he advocates this whole concept that every single error has to be looked at as a potential for even the smallest shaving of a marginal gain. It has to be looked like as an opportunity. And ever since I have been into this way of thinking, I have felt so much better about errors that I've made. I've kind of said, wow, that was a mistake, but okay, let's think about how we're going to set up a system to make sure that can never happen again. And you drill another hole in the Swiss cheese so that your Swiss cheese rule, that the airline industry uses the Swiss cheese analogy, that to get a fatal crash, you have to have the alignment of 3 holes for something to slip through the net. And, you know, getting an extra hole in there or plugging an extra hole so that that angle is not available anymore is part of error management and error minification. So when we talk about surgery, you know, we're talking about a range of competency, a range of surgical dexterity, a range of opinions, a range of, you know, personality traits. And to give you an example of how, you know, chaos and order can be distinguished by standardization or not. During our learning curve, which was a 4,000 eye learning curve, we froze our SMILE database at 4,000 eyes, and then we wrote this textbook based on all of the disasters that we generated during that learning curve, with a deep analysis as to how that happened. And I have a whole chapter on instrumentation, because along the way, I learned what was wrong with this particular. I switched to this instrument because it's better for that. Okay. But then I learned that this instrument has this feature, which caused this complication. I think, right, that's not good. And, you know, you can blow through a ton of instruments with that, with all everyone famous's names on them, but there's always something that's not quite right about it. And so it led to me asking Melosa to develop an instrument which was an amalgam of the best bits of all the other instruments, which I thought were the best parts, and eliminating the bits that caused complications once in a while due to some instrument design issue. And so this led to one separator with one design, and we spend a long time talking about the exact aspects of how this was designed in our course, because it pertains to how you approach the standardized way of removing a lenticle. You know, here you see 20 images. These are 20 steps, and we take about an hour and a half to go through this in the lecture. And you see, if you let the world carry on doing SMILE with all of the different instruments, by and large, it's going to be fine. So there's a lot of confirmation bias that gets generated by surgeons who use this instrument, which might have created this problem every 1 in 200 eyes. It's like, well, I don't have that problem. The guy only does 200 eyes a year, so he's going to take him years to find that eye. Well, it's the outliers that you get to crunch into the middle and you get rid of the outlier complications by standardization. So in other words, individually, you may not learn where you are in this massive, pretty good surgery complication rate. Yeah, loss of 2 lines is about 1 in 1,000. We're all in the same boat. No, we're not. Because if you use a standardized instrument that's been designed according to all of the features of this instrument, you will actually eliminate these outlier events, the rare ones. And essentially that is the message about standardization that I wanted to impart on you. And I want to also talk about how standardization is not a relinquishing of your surgical prowess or your ability to innovate, because in a system where everyone's doing everything slightly differently, and one surgeon goes, wow, I use this particular viscoelastic one at this point, and I've changed my outcomes. And then he says it to everybody at a meeting, and everyone's doing 50 things that are different. And it turns out that it's not just that viscoelastic, it's that in conjunction with 4 other things that meant that it made a better outcome. So it's, even if these people all apply that, they may not find a difference because they didn't have the other 4 things in line. The point here is that if everyone starts by respecting the standard technique as being above everyone, it's not Dan Reinstein's technique, it's the technique for removing a lenticle, and it sits in the sky above us, and we're all doing the same thing, and then someone goes, ooh, I had this case the other day, and you know what, and guess what? And he tells the group at a meeting, and suddenly everyone changes and everyone avoids or can get out of that situation more quickly and more efficiently. So it's clearly a way, and I'm delighted here speaking to residents, because I don't get to do that really anymore much, once a year at the Columbia course in January. But the learning curve for any surgical procedure that you attempt will be way shorter if you have a standardized approach. You obviously will have to have a standardized teacher. The slower learning curve will get you probably to a similar place, probably over time. But if you want to get to those outcomes quickly, get to that level of safety, you want to get to expert safety level in the shortest amount of time, just copy the expert technique. Don't try to be a hero at the beginning, and become an innovator anytime you like. But if you are, study it, publish it, and share it so that everyone can benefit from it. So I've talked for about 35 minutes about a bit of SMILE, but really everything to do with SMILE. And let me go into it a little bit. I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm assuming that so far either I'm on the right track or no one's listening. So here we go. Like I said, when we talk about the standard method of removing a lenticle, we have basically a 20-step process, which we take an hour and a half to go through in, excruciating detail. And I talk about it like that in juxtaposition to the way that many teach SMILE, which is that it's basically a seven-step procedure. You insert the speculum, you dock, you cut with the femto, you open the small incision, you separate the interfaces, you remove the lenticle, you take the speculum out. Like a seven-step process. And we try and divide this out into much more granular steps so that it ends up being more like 178 steps. And by granularizing a procedure, that is what gets you the accuracy and therefore the precision of the process and the repeatability of the process. The post-op management of SMILE is essentially the same as LASIK. There's nothing really different about it. Most of the complications of SMILE are the same as LASIK, most. There are some that are different. Here comes the point where, as promised, Guy said, "Are you going to give your speculum lecture?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking of doing that." And he said, "Good." So here we are, and I'm going to talk about speculum insertion. And I know many of you have probably now inserted several hundred speculums, specula. Certainly when I'm talking to, highly accomplished refractive surgeons who come to our SMILE course, I'm talking to people who've put in 10,000 speculum in an eye. And so in that sense, it's a little bit embarrassing. But here are some aspects which I consider to be it's certainly important. And at your stage, I wish someone had talked to me about it rather than having to learn it the hard way. So realize that the insertion of the speculum is the beginning. This is where you've got the patient is awake, they're conscious, and they're anxious. And they're having surgery on their eye. You're not taking mole out of their shoulder. So this is a highly anxiety-provoking environment for anyone. I had surgery. I know what it is. I have a whole story about that. So this is when you're making first contact with the patient, and not only does the instrument have to be designed specifically for the task, in the case of refractive surgery, it's very advisable to use wide and broad metallic blades that are solid, because it avoids laborious taping and extraneous actions required with taping and drapes. And it actually reduces the expulsion, the extrusion of meibomium oil from the eyelid margins into the field. This is when you tape eyelashes back, you are actually expressing meibom into the tear film. And for femtosecond cutting, you don't want meibom in the tear film because that absorbs infrared femtosecond energy. So these clean separation blades are important. You have to have a screw action because any squeezing has to be prevented because it can cause suction losses and the like. So the design of the speculum is critical. And a question that I get asked a lot by patients, but I approach differently from many of my colleagues, is the use of sedatives. So most LASIK surgeons that I would ask would say, yes, all the patients get just a little bit of something. And benzodiazepines are very useful because they are anxiolytics. At higher doses, they're antispasmodic, but they can be sedative. And so clearly you'd want to use a short-acting one because it's, it starts acting quicker and it stops acting quicker. But the question is, who needs it? Does everyone need it? And the answer is most certainly not. And in fact, using a sedative can actually be counterproductive in refractive surgery. And I've got numerous examples of this. But this is one patient I saw in the last couple of years who came to me for referred for correction of this so-called decentration. But it wasn't a decentration. It was due to eye movements during the lenticular cut without suction loss that occurred because the patient was, he said, during the surgery, I wasn't able to really cooperate. I was feeling very drowsy. And you can imagine that he was having these torquing bell reflex motions of his eye, not sufficient to come off the contact glass, but sufficient to alter the pathway of cutting and create asymmetric astigmatism in the lenticle and therefore in the cornea. And so I'm sure that the use of sedatives in every patient leads to higher levels of complication because anxiety is normal. One of the first things that I'll say to a patient who sits down here on this chair in my consultation is that as they come in, I say, how are you feeling about all this so far? And most of them say, okay, but maybe a little anxious, which is the British way of saying, I'm bricking it. And then my response to that is, good. Because if you came in here and said, I'm fine, that would be denial. And then they laugh, and then I laugh. And then I say, no, it's normal to have some anxiety. It's eye surgery. So everyone has anxiety, 100%. But how many people are in the subgroup that require a sedative? And I say require, meaning they have an anxiety disorder. They have a disorder of anxiety reaction. Panic attacks, claustrophobia, abnormal reactions that will require a drug treatment to make the anxiety reaction normal, not abnormal, because those can be detrimental to the outcome. And in our practice, we analyze this on an ongoing basis. It hovers between 2.9 and here we are 3.11 last year. We give sedatives to 3% of our patients only, and that is because of specific criteria. The others get chocolate. They get chocolate and they get verbal anesthesia. Well, everyone gets verbal anesthesia, but we use a combination of chocolate and verbal anesthesia or hypnothesis in order to get them through this highly emotionally charged procedure. And I don't know if Roger Saldivar is online, or certainly Roberto is not, but I was very fortunate to be a mini fellow of Roberto's in 1997. And I spent a month with him in Mendoza, and I have copious notes and from my little HP 200LX palm top that I had in my hands there. And one of the things that I wrote down, and it just impressed me so much, he was operating on about, I'll tell you, he was operating on about 90 eyes in an hour and a half. He had 2 lasers back to back, and he swung his chair around from one of the lasers to the other. And the nurses prepared, everything on one, so he would swing around and start the next case. The nurses put the speculum in, actually, funnily. The first thing he would do when he would turn his chair over to that patient would be he would put his hand on the patient's forehead and say, no te preocupes, todo va a estar muy bien. Don't worry, everything's going to be just fine. And I first noticed it, and then I verified it over and over again, and I could just see, as he said that, I could see the patient's shoulders just dropping into the bed, just relaxing. This hand on the forehead, and don't worry, it's going to be very easy. What is verbal anesthesia or hypnothesis? It's essentially a combination of verbal management skills that place the patient into a straitjacket, a virtual straitjacket. Because obviously people are, what happens if I move? Are you going to strap my head down? Oh, what about the clamp? Everyone is concerned about it. They watch way too much YouTube before coming in for surgery themselves. And it's actually, you say to them, no, we don't strap the, no, we don't have to tie you down, no. Well, what happens if I move? Nothing happens if you move. The procedure stops, but you can't hurt yourself. So it's just a sequence. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to know. Not telling you what I'm doing, telling you what you need to know. And, one step builds on the previous step. And we, if you move, something's not right at one step, we just wait and we carry on to the next step. It's all just a sequence. It's very, very easy. There's nothing to worry about. But how do we get this, what I call the virtual straitjacket, onto the patient? Well, it's a matter of, this is a routine. I mean, anybody's come to visit me will see this. We start off by saying everything's going to be fine. And then we start off by adjusting the neck. Now, most people, when they lie down, their primary position is going to be chin up. They're tense, and all those muscles are tensed up, like at the dentist. And the first thing I do is I literally grab their head tight with my fingers, and I rotate. I flex the neck. I take it from extension almost into flexion, and say, just let those muscles go. Okay, just keep your head really floppy, nice and relaxed. Relax the neck, relax the chin. Just sink into the pillow here. You feel little rails on the side of the head. Just let the head sink into the pillow. And then I look down their body and I say, can you just move your hips 2 inches to the right? And they move 2 inches to the right, and that might move them like a millimeter up here. And then I say to them, and this is the critical move, just move your shoulders 1 millimeter to the left. So they go like this. If they go a lot, I say, whoa, 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 1 millimeter. Okay. Okay, can you go 1 millimeter now to the right? Oh. And while you're doing that, suddenly in their mind, the limits of where they're allowed to move suddenly close in on them, right? Because you're saying move 1 millimeter to the left, and they go like this, and they think, I barely moved. And then you say, you know what, just try a millimeter, just a little bit, 1 millimeter to the right. And then suddenly they have to split that movement into half. So this kind of creates a sort of like an invisible strap around their body that tends to immobilize people like that. The effect that you're trying to achieve is, a deer in the headlights, or as the British say, a rabbit in the headlights. I don't know why in America it's a deer and in England it's a rabbit. But in our textbook we have scripts. We have scripts at the back of the book for every single part of the process, so that everything is exactly scripted. And if you come to visit us here, which I hope many of you will one day when it's possible, and you sit in the OR with myself or Glenn or Alistair, you will hear the same words out of the three of us at the same time in the same way with a different accent. I have an American accent. Glenn speaks with a South African accent, and Alistair is the only Brit, but he's from the north of England, so no one understands much of what he's saying. So it's the scripting and it's the process. The patients have a blanket put over them, and they get given a fluffy toy. The boys get a shark, the girls get a little Peppa Pig. And this acts as a stress ball, but it's also comforting because it kind of brings you back to early psychological moments. But actually, what we're doing is we're bringing the hands together and keeping them together in one place, because patients who have their hands by their sides will then feel free to react and bring it up. Whereas if you have them holding something, they're much less likely to separate the hands during the procedure. We've had to switch to disposables. So now these are, $1 each or whatever. And of course, because you can't have the same toy being handed from patient to patient in the new COVID era, but the effect works just as well. And I want to, move then into, what I mean by hypnothesis. And I had a visitor good 10 years ago from the Netherlands, and he was trying to, he came over to see what SMILE was like, and we did a morning of surgery. We have a break, came upstairs here to my office to have a little coffee. And he said, where did you do your hypnotherapy training? And I said, I haven't done hypnotherapy training. He goes, what? He said, you're kidding. I said, no, no. He says, look, I've been a hypnotherapist for 30 years. I did formal hypnosis training, and I use it in my practice all the time. What you're doing down there, that's called hypnothesis. Exactly. Exactly. It turns out that, you know, through trial and error, I developed some kind of way that approached what is officially known as hypnothesis. If you want to learn about this, you should talk to Doyle Stolting, who's, I believe, now retired from main practice, but still does keratoconus treatments in Atlanta. Doyle is a great friend and mentor, actually, to me. And he's become very interested in hypnosis and was actually I think he's trying to teach a course at the AAO now on this. The elements of hypnosis are that you must speak in a rhythmic way, and you must speak with a low tone of voice, but with a lot of inflection. So it's not a boring tone. It's something which has a lot of ups and downs. And the rhythm of speech is important. Leaving gaps is something that creates anxiety. So what you want to do is to have ebbs and flows and rubato style speaking rhythm, which is at once very clear and in diction, but is intimate and low-key and repetitive and has a lot of positive reinforcement words. Now, the way to get into this is to have a script. It's only the super experts, I guess, or the improv actors that can really do something different every time and still maintain this flow and this process and this rhythm. So set a script and make sure that your script has a lot of words that contain calm, relaxed, easy, good, excellent, very good, perfect, super. You're doing very well, and you're just going to look at the green light, and you're going to just see it move now. That's great, and just look straight at it. Obviously, what you're doing is you're telling the patient what they're about to experience. You are not saying, now I am going to apply the suction. Now the laser is cutting through your cornea. You know, you're not saying what is happening. You're saying what they're going to feel. So instead you would say, now you will see it become cloudy. And that green light might actually disappear. That's okay. Don't worry. Just keep looking straight ahead. Just nice and relaxed, breathing gently, holding steady. Perfect. Another 5 seconds. You're doing very well. Excellent. Perfect. Very, very good. Super. Great. You're doing super well. That's very, very good. Now what I want you to do is just to look straight up into the light. And that's great. You're doing very well. That's perfect. Excellent. You're going to see some things moving around in front of you, a little pushing, a little pulling maybe. Very, very good. That's great. Excellent. So that's basically the sort of demonstration. And the point is that you're trying to get someone into this state of mind, which is below full consciousness, but it's above sleep. It's that zone. It's that twilight zone where they can hear everything in the room. They can hear your instructions. They can hear what's happening. If someone said there's a fire, they'd be able to run out of the room straight away and save their lives. But they're not quite in full consciousness. And in that state, as it turns out, the mind is susceptible to suggestion. And so you can't be made with hypnosis to do something you never wanted to do. That's not possible. I mean, all those things that you see on television with the guy acting like a monkey and that is either put on or the person wanted to act like a monkey. But you can't make people do things against their will in the state of hypnosis. That's not possible. But what you are able to do is to introduce elements of behavior change, and that's why it's used for smoking cessation and weight loss and all of these things. So let's step away from that slightly into certain other aspects of managing the anxious patient, and that is control of the patient. Because sometimes the anxiety is so overriding that the patient is not able to listen to you well. And in fact, they're not listening to you. And in fact, they're all by themselves in the forest, in the rain, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, and they can't see where they're going and they're scared. And you're talking and they don't hear a word of it. And this is a frequent occurrence, which you then need to develop ways of getting around. And one of them, of course, is to use your position of authority. Sometimes that changing your tone of voice to the authoritative voice. Mike, I need you to stay with me here, okay? I think you weren't really listening to what I was saying as I was going. I wasn't. Well, you know, when I was saying to you that you should not follow the green light, you were following light, weren't you? Well, yeah, I was trying to follow it. I said, well, that's my point. I was saying, don't follow the light, but you're obviously, you know, a bit anxious. So what I need you to do is to not be all by yourself in the forest, in the dark, in the rain. I need you to be in the forest, in the dark, in the rain, but imagine that my voice is my hand and I'm holding your hand and I've got night vision goggles and I'm going to walk us through to get out of the forest back onto the road. So that's who I am. And you need to lock onto my voice and I will go through this and I will make it very easy. But you do need to lock onto my voice. It's the most important thing for you right now. That's what's going to help you get through this. So you have to use that slight authority tone. So those slides would be the diversion to getting to putting the speculum in. And so now I'm going to show you how to put a speculum in. And first what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this, and then I'm going to stop frame it so that I can go over my thoughts on speculum insertion. And in fact, I'm just going to make sure that my video sharing is optimized for sound and video. There we go. Okay, there we go. So.
Okay, so if you open your eyes there, you'll see a white circle there. You just look at that. And I'm just going to hold the lashes. You're looking straight. That's great. Super. Perfect. Now, if I block the light, you're still looking in that direction the whole time. So always looking in that direction. Even if I block the light, always looking in that direction. Very, very good. Excellent. Super. A little bit of support here for the lid. Maybe feel a little pushing. That's beautiful. And I'm just going to widen this up. In about 30 seconds, you won't even know this is there. As strange as it feels at first. That's beautiful. Perfect. Excellent. Super. Very, very good.
Okay, so that's basically the speculum insertion. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to now go over it in steps. So step number one is you say to the patient, open your eye and look at the light or the white circle. The next thing you do is you say, I'm just going to hold your lashes. Now what you're doing is you're going to bring your index finger over and actually hold the lashes, but you're going to cheat. So I did magic as a kid, and magic is all about telling people what you're doing when you're actually doing that plus something else and hiding the something else. So here you're saying, I'm just going to hold the lashes. No one is going to freak out by someone saying, I'm going to hold your lashes. But if you said, I'm going to hold your eyelid, right there, they're going to get anxious because no one wants their eyelid held because now they're thinking Clockwork Orange. Oh shit, he's going to put the speculum in. So I'm just going to hold your lashes. You're looking straight. So looking here, so I'm just going to hold your lashes here. Just going to hold your lashes right there. That's great. Now, watch what I did. I rotated the index finger onto the tarsal plate, and there I am, really controlling this eyelid. Now, when you have your index finger on the tarsal plate, even if they squeeze, they won't be able to shut their eye because you have a finger against a wall, basically. And if they squeeze, you have control of that eyelid. And some do squeeze, and so you need that control. Now, at that point, You see, I already have the speculum in my other hand as I'm doing this, and I've brought it to a position that is outside of their visual field, okay? Outside of their visual field, which means they can't see it, but it's already close and it's at the level. And what I do is the speech allows me to surreptitiously bring the speculum into the field, which is different from saying, I'm going to put this eyelid holder in, and then this big old contraption comes towards them. What you say is, I'm just going to block your view. So I'm outside of the field, and I say, I'm just going to block your view, and I block the view with the speculum. So they're thinking, well, he's just blocking the view with his finger or something. I can't see, it's too close. And then you use the separation between the blades to continue the speech and say, I'm just going to block your view. So if I block it, you're still looking in that direction, always looking in that direction, even if I block it in that direction. So you're giving them a view of the light that they're having to look at, even if I block it, always looking in that direction. And what that does is it puts a virtual straitjacket around their extraocular muscles, because now they're locked into that light. And they know that no matter what you do, they should not take their eyes off that direction. At this point, the speculum is already very close to the eyelid. And you then do the very surreptitious rotation of the upper blade downward. They can't see this. They can't see the rotation because you're blocking their view. See, I'm rotating the upper blade downward. And low enough that when I let go of the eyelid, it will engage into the upper lid. And so they don't feel you putting the speculum into the lid. The release of the upper lid allows the lid to go into the speculum. It's not the same as putting the speculum in the lid, it's putting the lid into the speculum. At that point, you're kind of like on the winning wicket here. So then you say, you're talking about support for the eyelid, not speculum, not eyelid holder, not Clockwork Orange weird thing, clamp. And then you need to grab the lower lid, but you need to grab it from the lower part, almost the cheek. And you need to make sure that you pull the skin way back and create this big gap here between the globe and the eyelid so that you can rotate the lower blade down and again release the lower lid into the speculum. So suddenly you've got this thing in without them realizing you put it in. In fact, you didn't put it in, you put their eyelids around the speculum, which is a completely different experience. And I'm sure that you're all residents and that none of you have had a speculum put in your eyes. And I would suggest that on Monday, when you get into the OR again, you each try this on each other. Believe me, you will be shocked at how horrible it feels to have a speculum put in your eye. So this is golden stuff for any surgery you're going to do. And this, which brings me to point out that when you start opening the speculum, you need to do it very slowly. And try this on yourselves. Open it fast, and you'll see. It's shocking when you open a speculum fast. So you need to open it very, very slowly. I take my time. In fact, I take more time over opening the speculum than I do out of removing the lenticule. Because that I can do, in a few, like 2 or 3 seconds, right? Once it's separated, I just take it out. But this I do not do in a few seconds. This I take many seconds because opening it gently is critical. Now, why am I talking so much about this? Because in the event of having surgery while you're awake, if you lose the patient's confidence by an abrupt move or a painful move or an uncomfortable move, the rest of the procedure, you are on the back foot. And the patient is really tense. And because they're really tense, they're not going to be as cooperative. And they'll keep on tensing their neck up and moving and not looking at the light and So, okay, last part is that once the speculum is in, is the AWACS, the radar, the satellite warning system, which is the index finger of the hand that is temporal to the patient. And you put that on the patient's head, and then you hold the upper blade with your index finger. And the reason for that during the rest of the femtosecond cutting is that if under the laser and under the contraption where you can't see the patient yourself directly, you're looking through the microscope. If there's any squeezing that is about to start, your finger will pick that up before anything else. And that's your early warning system so that you can modify or adjust to what's about to happen if the patient's about to squeeze, okay? So I'm just gonna now play that again. It is a good 49 seconds. So as you can see, it's almost a minute to just put the speculum in.
Okay, so if you open your eyes there, you'll see a white circle there. You just look at that. And I'm just going to hold the lashes. You're looking straight. That's great. Super. Perfect. Now, if I block the light, you're still looking in that direction the whole time. So always looking in that direction. Even if I block the light, always looking in that direction. Very, very good. Excellent. Super. A little bit of support here for the lid. Maybe feel a little pushing. That's beautiful. And I'm just going to widen this up. In about 30 seconds, you won't even know this is there. As strange as it feels at first. That's beautiful. Perfect. Excellent. Super. Very, very good.
And by the way, when we do this for the second eye, we don't have to take quite as long because you can't do the same thing again or you get caught, right? So what you do is you say, I'm just going to hold the lid and I'm going to put the support for the eyelid in again the same way. Everything's exactly the same. And now you've got to say exactly the same over and over again because now they remember that the first time it wasn't too bad. So your key words for the second eye are exactly the same. You have to keep on saying that. And you say it's exactly the same as the other side, just the same. Don't worry, it's exactly the same. But then you say the only difference is that some people feel it more on the second eye, but that's just because you're expecting everything. Everything is exactly the same. So they might think, and they often do think, it's more uncomfortable on the second eye, but of course it's because they have now anticipation and they're but you've anticipated them thinking that. And so again, the mind reading hypnothesis process is that the trust comes from you saying that something's going to happen and then it happening. And then saying something's going to happen, and then it happens. And as that process happens right from the start, they start to gain confidence in you manipulating their eye. And once that sequence, if you start doing things without warning, that's when the antennas go up and they get anxious again, and you're on a back wicket again, back foot. So I'm supposed to talk about smile. So what I thought I would do is I show you a full smile procedure, unedited. It takes 1 minute, 16 seconds. But as you will be aware, there's a lot behind this. So this is once the suction has been achieved. The lenticule cut, which is the refractive cut, is now being made within the substance of the cornea. We're monitoring for eye movements. We're the most awake we ever are in our lives is during this cutting because we need to be very astutely aware of the bubble pattern, the quality of the bubbles, and whether there are any eye movements whatsoever during the cutting, which could affect the optical outcome. We bring the patient to the microscope and we open the incision, and there are various techniques wrapped into an envelope here that I'm going through very, very quickly. I can't tell you all of them, but we separate the edge of the lenticule, and then we go above the lenticule and separate the cap from the lenticule surface. And then we go below the lenticule and we shell out the lenticule, punch through at one end, separate the edge, punch through and again, and then finally the little triangle that we left attached go above the lenticule, and then remove it atraumatically through the incision, and then we check the lenticule on the cornea. So that's SMILE. It's an extraordinarily efficient way of correcting vision for the surgeon. Here's another example. This is just another one. These are just, we've got hundreds of these, but here's two random selections. As you can see, Both of these are left eyes. If I should really choose a right eye, and show you that all the instruments are reversed. So we do everything on the left eye with the same instrument that we do with the other eye, and so I do left eyes with my left hand and right eyes with my right hand. And both my fellows who now work here, Glenn, who's been with me for 15 years, and Alistair for 3, they both came in saying, no, I'm right-handed. I do all my phacos in the left eyes with my right hand. And I'm like, that's not how you're going to do refractive surgery. You're going to use both hands. No, I can't do it. I can't do it. And both of them, I said, yes, you can. And then after a while, and now they're, and you look at their, and this could have been Glenn or Alistair operating, or me. You could show me any of their videos or my videos, and promise me $1,000 if I guess who the surgeon is, and I'd only have a 1 in 3 chance of guessing it right, because we all do it exactly the same way. So I'm going to finish off by talking about SMILE the way you need to know as residents. And so there are 3 areas where SMILE has some advantage. And the first one is the biomechanics. We know that the nerve plexus of the cornea runs in the anterior 125 microns of cornea. So it's concentrated up there, and so SMILE takes place below the nerve plexus, and therefore, you're not really cutting the nerve plexus, are you? Except, you know, in 1 or 2 places to get into the lenticular surface. So from that standpoint, it's very neat, because you see, now that we make flaps with femtosecond lasers, we're making very thin flaps, and those thin flaps are inside the nerve plexus, and the ablation takes care of the rest of the nerve plexus. So we are hurting a lot more of the nerve plexus. We are cutting a lot more of it, and so that's why LASIK takes longer for the dry eye. And notice how I'm using, you know, air quotes here, because it's not dry eye. It's a sort of hypersensitivity syndrome, essentially, combined with a meibomian gland dysfunction that's exacerbated by cutting the corneal nerves and changing all the reflex arcs. There are multiple publications on dry eye after SMILE using a Cochet-Bonnet aesthesiometer, and there are multiple LASIK publications. I concatenated the 13 LASIK studies, the 7 SMILE studies, and our study, which was data out to 1 year. And it shows you that with LASIK, of course, corneal sensation in the center goes to practically nothing once the flap is cut. Of course, it goes to practically nothing. You've cut all the nerves. But it recovers, and eventually, you know, it goes back to kind of normal. But with SMILE, it's basically a neuropraxis. It's the manipulation of the nerves that kind of nongs them a little bit. They don't function as well. But that neuropraxis recovers within a few days to weeks. And so that's why the neural reflex arc, the blinking reflex, the meibomian gland dysfunction reflex, all of those reflexes are disrupted less with SMILE than with LASIK. And we will do SMILE in someone with dry eye. We will actually do, because it's not going to change their dry eye status. It'll depress it slightly for a temporary amount of time, but it won't change their status. And it's because we're operating beneath the nerve plexus. Now, when I say dry, I'm not going to take someone with Sjögren's syndrome and 4+ SPK generalized all over the cornea and a Schirmer's of 0.5 millimeters. But if someone has a tiny bit of SPK inferiorly, and you know they're managing their meibomian gland dysfunction, they can easily have SMILE, where you would have been a little cautious about doing LASIK. And confocal microscopy demonstrates beautifully from Mario Nubile here in Italy, where, you know, LASIK, obviously you see the nerves being cut within the flap. Flex, which is basically SMILE LASIK with, you know, SMILE with a flap, also cutting the nerves within the flap. But SMILE, you see here, the nerve plexus is maintained within the cap. And you do see the cut of the nerves, but it's down here where the lenticles are cut, right? So in terms of dry eye, that's an advantage. Now, the mechanics of LASIK. Now, this is one where, you know, Zeiss started marketing SMILE as better than LASIK because it's better biomechanics. And it came after this paper, which I published. And I said to them, you know, you're using my paper, you're putting it into the wrong context. I know words matter, but the context matters. And you're not using what I said in the right way. You're saying that the reason to do SMILE is because it leaves the cornea stronger. And that is a bad thing to say. because that implies that LASIK is leaving the cornea weaker and that it's weak and bad. And it's nothing wrong with LASIK. And there's so much redundant biomechanical substance of the cornea that you can take most of the cornea out, leaving 250 microns onto the bed, and that is going to be a cornea that's not going to get ectasia, it's going to be stable, no problem. There's massive redundancy in the cornea on biomechanics. So just because you're leaving more tensile strength doesn't make SMILE better. Here is what you need to understand about why the biomechanics of SMILE make SMILE an advantage, give SMILE an advantage over LASIK. The front fibers of the stroma are stronger than the back fibers, and no matter which way you measure it by different methods, you always get that answer. John Marshall showed that the tensile strength, the strain within the cornea, is higher for deeper flaps and lower for thinner flaps. But he showed that if you just do a side cut without the flap, just the side cut of the flap, you get almost the same change in strain within the cornea at a shallow or deep depth. And in the same paper showing that the delamination cut without a side cut, no matter whether it's shallow or deep, produces the same change in strain. And of course, SMILE is like a delamination, right? In the center, there's no side cut except the depth of the lenticule in the center of the cornea. So others have subsequently shown this in experimental models using forces applied to the inner side of the cornea. Walter Segundo did this with Farhad Hafesi in his cross-linking lab. And they showed that SMILE leaves the cornea about 1.5 times stronger than LASIK in equivalent, in like for like. Now, it became apparent to me that, because I'm lecturing residents and I talk about higher order aberrations, you're going to be lost in the soup because there's no way you're going to learn about that or know about that. You've heard of wavefront guided, and you've heard that this is all coming from, wavefront technology that comes from deformable mirrors that can allow us to see into deep space, taking care of aberrations through space that make the, images of distant galaxies much higher resolution just by taking care of the aberrations. And, understanding the physics of light and understanding what a wavefront is and understanding how these wavefronts can be deformed is the science of wavefront in the eye. And how we arbitrarily have chosen a mathematical construct of how to break down individual components which can be added together to describe a complex surface is a whole other science. You've heard of this in deconvolution in mathematics, where a series of sine waves can be combined to make a very complex wave. That's called a Fourier analysis, dividing everything into individual sine waves. Well, in the Zernike reconstruction, we're dividing it into different shapes that are related to spheres and cylinders and astigmatisms and bumps. And you can have 2 bumps or 3 bumps or 5 bumps or 4 bumps. And depending on how many bumps, you can be rotated in 4 different directions to get 4 different angles of a 4-bump structure. And this is a whole complex pyramid, and a combination of each of these will give you some complex surface, which is the wavefront of the eye. So the important ones that you need to know as a resident, I believe even now, I think it would be important, are these two. They're called spherical aberration and coma. Coma is called coma because that's from the Greek or Latin of a comet, and the comet has a tail. And so when you have an asymmetry where there's inferior steepening, for example, like in keratoconus, you get drawing down of lights. Spherical aberration is when, well, you know that, right? A sphere has very poor optics because the periphery of the sphere focuses light closer than the center of the sphere, and that's called spherical aberration. So you need to make a cornea in nature over millions and billions of years of evolution into an asphere, so that the peripheral rays and the central rays are all focused onto one point called the fovea. And our eyes are very optimized for spherical aberration. But the thing is, when you flatten a cornea artificially by taking tissue out of the center, you're increasing what's called spherical aberration. And spherical aberration is a bad aberration because it causes halo. And I explain this to patients like this. I say to them, you know, by doing this high myopic correction, we're going to increase your spherical aberration. And I will explain what spherical aberration is. It is spherical aberration. Okay, it's halo around a light. And, you know, all of these aberrations have their own distortion patterns. Trefoil has 3 tails. Trefoil, quadrifoil, you know. But here's what you got to know about spherical aberration. And that is that the higher the spherical aberration, the worse the night vision. And we've learned through the years and from going through the 90s that smaller optical zones created more spherical aberration. Now you understand why. And as you increase the optical zone size, so the quality of the night vision improves. Less spherical aberration, better night vision quality. The other way, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to put it graphically, of controlling spherical aberration is instead of cutting a spherical lens out of the eye, you can cut an aspheric lens out of the eye so that the final cornea is not more spherical. And so that's the other way of getting less spherical aberration. And you'll hear terms like wavefront optimized or aberration smart, ablation profile, things that are euphemisms for aspheric profiles that pre-compensate for the fact that we're going to induce spherical aberration by taking tissue, by flattening the center differentially from the periphery. And you see, back to SMILE, if we look at a retrospective analysis of matched controls for refraction and age, you see that in my practice, we use much larger optical zones on average for SMILE than we do for LASIK. In fact, we're taking 30% more tissue out of the cornea by ablation with the SMILE lenticule than we are for LASIK for matched levels of myopia, matched controls. And you say, well, that's terrible. You're taking more tissue out. That's a bad thing. I say, no, because the larger the optical zone, the less the spherical aberration. And you see, if we look at the post-operative relative tensile strength in the cornea, yes, the SMILE eyes are left with more post-operative tensile strength than the LASIK eyes. Yes, they are, because the front of the cornea is not cut, and so you're leaving stronger parts of the cornea behind. So that's obvious. But although we are 30% stronger at the end of an equivalent refraction, taking 30% more tissue out. So we're taking 30% more tissue, but we're leaving the cornea 30% stronger because of the properties of SMILE. The relationships are interesting. So this is the amount of myopia corrected plotted against the induction of spherical aberration. So in a 6 millimeter zone, you induce spherical aberration like so. In a 6.5, you induce less. In a 7 millimeter zone, you induce even less spherical aberration. And how this compares to LASIK done in a 6 millimeter zone, in these cases that I'm showing you, you can take out less tissue by SMILE and induce the same amount of spherical aberration. Or you can take out equal tissue by SMILE than LASIK and induce less spherical aberration. Or you can take a hell of a lot more tissue out by SMILE than you would by LASIK, but you induce way less spherical aberration, and you're still leaving the cornea stronger than if you'd cut the flap, and now the flap doesn't contribute to the tensile strength of the cornea. So overall, we're inducing 65% less spherical aberration with SMILE, like for like in matched controls. And so not just us, but others have been showing this clinically in clinical studies, showing less aberrations after SMILE than LASIK. And so it is not the tensile strength that makes SMILE better. It's the fact that the properties of how we get to releasing less tensile strength in the cornea by allowing us to use larger optical zones, that gets us better optical quality by inducing less spherical aberration. So that's the reason why the biomechanical advantage of SMILE becomes a benefit to the patient, not the biomechanics alone. Nothing wrong with LASIK, LASIK is perfectly adequate. You can do LASIK. If SMILE had never come along, we'd have been fine. Thank you very much. LASIK is an excellent procedure, no problem. The last area where SMILE has an advantage, I would say, is in the retreatment options. And that is because the retreatment rate is exceedingly low because it's a very accurate procedure. And cylinder correction is more accurate because you've got the eye immobilized when you're making the cylindrical correction. You don't depend on an eye tracker chasing the eye around when all the spots are flying around trying to get that cylinder corrected. The options for enhancement are worth going through because people have different ideas about it. The best way of doing it is to make a thin flap on top of the SMILE. That's why SMILE is such a great primary procedure, because then the enhancement is a primary LASIK, which also carries super low complication rates. But people do PRK on top of it, and it has all the pain and haze and slow visual recovery disadvantages of PRK that we talked about right at the beginning, all the epithelial healing characteristics, which take months to establish themselves. And you've all seen PRK procedures where you just remove the epithelium by alcohol soaking. You basically wipe the epithelium away. The hemidesmosomes have been broken by the alcohol, and you can just literally show a very nice, beautiful, smooth, clean Bowman surface. You do your excimer laser ablation. You put there's the ablated area. You put your bandage contact lens on. Bob's your uncle. Very easy, very nice. The problem is that you got this slow healing. Now, one of the advantages is that if you have a crinkly cap, this is like our early SMILE cases before we had the flap distension protocol at the end of the SMILE procedure, but we learned that from doing PRK enhancements afterwards. You can actually use wet PTK to completely smooth out those folds if you see them as you go, and polish it. Now, one of the ways it's been used in the US for enhancement is to do a side cut into the original SMILE interface. And that's great. You convert the cap into a flap, and then you can do an ablation. And that's been looked at and published extensively. You basically will see this side cut being created using a LASIK flap program, but without the lamellar cut. So you only do the side cut of the flap, and you have your little hinge here, okay? And then there's the circle option, which will be available in the US very soon. It's a process where you take the original SMILE interface and enlarge the ablation zone by making a flap that has a truncation connector so that you don't miss the actual level of the SMILE interface by trying to enlarge. So you enlarge the ablation. So you might have done a SMILE in a 7.5 millimeter zone, and that's not going to be wide enough to do a hyperopic enhancement, for example, because you need a larger transition zone. Well, you use a circle program to extend the ablation area and lift all of that as a flap. But my preferred way, I should show you the video of that to show you how neat that looks. My preferred method, there's the little junction cut, and now the extension cut that goes to the junction. And then you can see that you can lift this up, and now you've got this area where there's a little dissection here. So it's not totally complication free. This is an example of where a circle procedure can end up a little odd. But you have this, extension of the ablation zone to where the original SMILE was, you see? And that becomes the flap. And then, and there you are. And here's the original SMILE incision. And there is the LASIK flap. Here's a high frequency ultrasound image of the SMILE interface. And here it is after circle. You can see the little step here where the junction has been joined. So the preferred way of doing this is to make a flap over the LASIK. And that's because you're using tissue from the surface. You're not wasting tissue inside this big fat cap, creating into a flap. And you can ensure that you're not entering into the epithelium or crossing the original SMILE interface by measurements. So if you measure the epithelial profile and the full cap thickness, you can actually plan your cuts so that you can take a cornea that's post-op and create, based on the thickest epithelial point and the thinnest cap point. That's your window. And then you place this new flap in the middle of that window to avoid each of these surfaces. And then you can just go ahead, as I did in this case. And as you can see, I created a beautiful flap here above the original interface and did an hyperopic ablation. So you can see there's less intervening stromal component here than there is in the center, because my ablation was on the surface of the remaining residual stroma of the cap. And there are 2 incisions, and there we are, a difference map correcting the astigmatism. The technique for lifting the flap is very specific. We've published 2 papers on this because we generated a lot of complications with the instrument diving into the wrong plane. And so by specifying a very specific protocol on how to separate a thin LASIK flap over a smile interface, we avoid these, pizza Humpty Dumpty put them back together again situations, which are needless to say, rather unpleasant. But as you can see, I don't know if this video is running properly here. It's not really running properly. Hold on. Well, as you can see, the flap is created just as it would, and then the instrument is poked out, and then you dissect back towards the hinge, producing a pseudo hinge up here. And then at the end, you separate the pseudo hinge. That's the technique. You can go through that on the papers. So the routine procedures are something which you don't need to know. The management of complications. The main complication feared is suction loss. Suction loss is not that common. It was most common in the earlier studies when the suction was lower and the surgeons were less experienced. But now the suction rate is around 1 in 200. And the software of the laser itself, depending on where along the procedure the suction occurs, so the software actually has a wizard that tells you what to do next. There's one point during the procedure where if you get a suction loss during that part, you'll have to convert to LASIK. That's why you can never poo LASIK to a patient. You can never say LASIK is a second best procedure. You always talk about it as another alternative because you may have to switch to it. But essentially, the wizard guides you through what you can do at what stage. We've made this simple 5-step procedure into, well, as I showed you always, much more 55 steps. But there's an absolute logic to this flow diagram. And once you learn this, your heart rate will remain exactly constant no matter what happens suction loss-wise in SMILE. And we spend a good 2 hours on explaining this process so that at the end of this, or if you read the textbook, you will see that suction loss is really not a problem of suction. It's not a complication. It's a deviation in how you're going to manage the patient. We've published the outcomes of suction loss. We were able to publish matched outcomes because we did SMILE in the other eye of 20 patients, and only 1 patient we had to do LASIK in both eyes, so we couldn't do the outcomes of that one. But we were comparing like for like here, and the outcomes of suction loss or the fellow eye are exactly the same safety, and all of the patients received treatment on the same day and went home and came back the next day seeing the way intended. So again, a complication is not necessarily a disaster. It's just possibly a change in plan to get the patient to the outcome that they came to you for in the first place. So managing complications must always be thought of not as kind of horrific, panic moments, but rather as management opportunities. And we have something like 150 pages in the textbook devoted to managing complications, but we really want to think of them, like I said, as managing intraoperative situations that are not routine. And we go through these in excruciating detail. Obviously, nothing that you have to know yourself now, but just to say that there's nothing threatening to a 58-year-old like me, cardiac-wise with SMILE. And I want to finish with, to reiterate, because a lot of you may never do SMILE, and many of you may do refractive surgery and not get to SMILE. So I don't want the end of the lecture to be like, oh, this guy talked about SMILE, it's like the best thing. It is a great thing, but I want to be very clear. LASIK and SMILE, in my practice, I cannot distinguish the outcomes between the two. There are a couple of things that are different, as I've shown you, but in terms of visual outcomes, they are the same. And you will find publications in the literature that say that SMILE is better. And you will find publications in the literature that say that LASIK is better, or wavefront guided LASIK is better, or topography guided LASIK is better, or trans PRK is better, or ASA is better, or Jesus, you name it. The fact is, I cannot find a difference in outcomes between SMILE and LASIK. And I would say that it's much harder to be able to get the outcomes to be the same in a retrospective analysis than to get them to be different. It's easier to land on one laser or the other laser for which one's better. That's just falling off a knife edge. But staying on the log in the river is harder. And amazingly, we cannot distinguish the difference. So I would almost say that if you're equally expert at SMILE as you are at LASIK, you will get the same outcomes, or equally bad at SMILE as bad at LASIK. But you know, the point is, if your level is the same in both, you'll get the same outcomes. We managed to do a quick comparison here, looking at matched controls. So it's a very specific data set that we chose with low cylinder because it was an analysis that we did for the FDA. But you know, 137 eyes here in this subgroup. And we matched them to as many LASIK control eyes that I could find in our database, matched controls, matched for age and everything else. And we found that, guess what? The outcomes were identical in terms of efficacy, identical in terms of safety, identical in terms of accuracy. And here is our 4,000 eye database, which we froze and analyzed for the textbook. And as you can see, you know, 95% of the eyes, this is for myopia up to -9, 95% are 20/20 with one procedure. That's pretty crazy. And in terms of the safety, we had 8 per 10,000 losing 2 lines, but we can account for all of those. One eye was one where we had translucent, dark, uncut lines. And this is in the textbook. This is part of teaching about the observation of bubble patterns, which we learned from this eye. And we learned something about this. And in fact, this eye, I fixed it with a transepithelial PTK and a subsequent refractive procedure. The patient has not lost any lines, 0, and has a perfect 2012 outcome. But in the analysis, of course, it ended up losing 2 lines. And we have another 2 eyes that got cystic epitheliopathy, which is often seen in lamellar procedures, but both of them resolved by PTK procedures. So we ended up with no eyes losing 2 lines after the therapeutic intervention. There's your scattergram of 4,000 eyes, and you can see that the scatter is rarely outside of the 1 diopter range. 88% are within a half diopter. That is amazing. And the stability is reached very, very early in SMILE. That's something which is very impressive. Cyclotorsional control, people always say, oh, you can't control the cylinder because you don't have eye tracking, you don't have cyclotorsional tracking. That's a ridiculous thing to say to someone who knows something about SMILE, because SMILE immobilizes the eyes. You don't have to track it. You just have to make sure that the eye is immobilized in the right position, and then the cylinder correction is perfect. So there's no problem with cylinder correction. There's no systematic error to the rotation. And the contrast sensitivity is, well, it's not changed. Yes, it's a slight increase, but that's almost certainly to do with the artifact of measuring contrast through the 4-opter and then measuring it without glasses through the air. But anyway, there's no change in contrast sensitivity. As I said, you know, if you want to go into this procedure, you need to go into it, read 450 pages and listen to 16.5 hours of narrated video. Take a course or 2, repeat the course several times. We, RSA members are given special consideration. I really encourage residents and RSA members, and we love having you on board because you ask all the best questions. You're unashamed and you're not bashful about asking questions. So please come. Thank you so much for listening to me for, I really went over time there. I took a little bit of a liberty there with some of my sidetrack comments, but I hope that I've given you a whirlwind account of SMILE, certainly sufficient for you to be able to answer board questions on SMILE, very easy. But then I hope that I've managed to contribute some elements that will help you in your general ophthalmology or retinal or glaucoma careers, whichever one you end up doing.
Thanks, Dr. Reinstein. I think that was great. And I loved the first half. I mean, you gave us, as resident surgeons, things that I'm personally taking into the OR on Tuesday, not doing SMILE, not doing any refractive surgeries, but things that will make us better surgeons and better doctors. My first question I have that came in, or a personal question actually, has to do with stress in the OR. Is this just something, either you have it or you don't, or is there something you can do to be a less stressful person in the OR when things go awry?
That's a great question. I think this is very personal. I mean, you know, I'm gonna lay it on the line here. My first cataract, which I did at the VA, at the Bronx VA, which would have been September 95, was an extra cap in an old vet who had a, you know, really white cataract, and there was nothing to lose. I am ashamed to say that it took me an hour and a half, one extra cap. And God bless Dr. Mindell for sitting with me for that hour and a half and not falling off his chair. I had no control over my hands. I was totally unprepared. I had not done enough pig eye. I certainly had not practiced on suturing technique enough. It was an unmitigated disaster. And I left the operating room thinking to myself, you know, I was sweating, but I didn't lose it. And I think that is something which, I don't know, I think it's very personal. I think that in medicine, the balance between empathy and sympathy, that dial has to be set just right if you're a surgeon. Because if that dial is too far on the empathy side, you probably will decompensate. So there's something about the surgical mind. Maybe I should add another little triangle to that prerequisites for a refractive surgeon. But you need to be a little bit psychopathic. And I say a little bit, right? You got to have that little bit of detachment from something that is happening that is bad to another fellow human being. If you don't have the ability to detach from that, then you will do what all humans do when they get empathically involved, and that is lose the ability to think straight. Anxiety stops processing of information. So when you have a very anxious patient, you're getting informed consent from them and you're explaining all these things. And then they ask a question which you clearly covered for 5 minutes, 2 minutes ago. They're not listening. They're not listening because they're anxious. They can't process those words. So I would say that for the beginning surgeon, look, I was a beginning surgeon in ICLs way into my career, having not done a cataract for 15 years. So I had those moments. I had them repeated at an old age. But I had a more experience in understanding how to control the empathic side of my humanity so that it doesn't take over. And I think that's really what I say. Some people, I know some residents who would use, pop a little 5 milligrams of a beta blocker, or a drop of timolol in your nose, 0.5% timolol. It helps beautifully with coffee-induced tremor. So how do you drink coffee between eye surgery? You drink the coffee and you put a drop of timolol in your nose and you're fine. You're steady as a rock in the OR. You get rid of those mini M plate potentials.
Dan, William Osler referred to what you're talking about as equanimitas in his classic essay. And it is a fundamental part of being a doctor. I've got a couple of technical questions about SMILE, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
One of the things that you mentioned was about suction loss. The other thing that early surgeons in SMILE, and maybe some of the residents who might have an opportunity might be doing some of this, is centration. And
Yeah.
you've gone to elaborate steps in order to make sure you have the right centration. Tell us a little bit about why centration is important. You talked about a wider optical zone. Does that mean I can decenter with immunity? Or do I need to be very central? Is centration important, and how do you do it?
Centration is actually a critical component of SMILE, a really critical component. In fact, when I start the centration lectures at our course, I place the blame for a decentration squarely on the surgeon. SMILE is one of those procedures where if there is a decentration, it's your fault, because it's your choice to step on the pedal when you can see where the pupil is relative to the visual axis. You can see it. It's right in front of you in the microscope. So if you step on the pedal and you get a decentration, that's your fault. It's lack of preparation, or it's lack of skill in docking, or it's lack of judgment because you weren't able to get the right centration and you still carry on. So it doesn't matter what the aspect is, it's your fault, whichever reason. So when we talk about centration, we talk about all of the aspects of centration. We talk about the simple, the simple Hirschberg test, just making sure that you've got the location of the reflex documented in your medical record, the reference image that's in front of you, which you're going to use to reference the position of the docking. And that reference image is what you're going to use in an operating room. Here is my operating room with the reference image and our checkpoints here. And here is our RSA member and friends from Peru with exactly the same setup as if it's like a duplicate. And that's what I love about standardization, is that you can teach people to do exactly the same thing, and then they can get the same outcomes in their first 10 eyes that you got in 400 eyes. And so what the patient sees, and talking about all of the elements of this docking and the process, the individual steps of producing a perfect centration. This is the patient view of the procedure as you're coming into the contact lesson. We try and teach this in the most graphic detail, so that at the end of the day, there are no remaining questions as to how the 6 stages of docking produce perfect centration. And if you don't have perfect centration, then don't step on the pedal, uncouple again and try again. So again, it's in the old days when we had no trackers, centration was randomly thrown at us, problems with that because the patient moved more or the alignment wasn't right. In the days of early tracking, the problems were that companies didn't realize that tracking does not get rid of good positioning. You can end up with perfect tracking and an like a tangentially offset ablation angle, and you can end up with a totally weird result because of the angle of incidence of the excimer. So tracking is not the answer. Fixation is not the answer. The full answer is surgical skill is my answer.
Thank you.
Another question we had come in was about OBL. Could you, I feel like this is something, if you've seen, within your first 50 cases of LASIK, maybe you've seen, but could you describe what it is? And then also talk to us about, because I feel like a lot of us probably haven't seen SMILE. How does OBL affect SMILE?
A lot. So, I mean, you guys are, I might as well have just started the course at the beginning. We can stay here for 5 hours and do half of it. But here, let me show you David Kang's beautiful montage. This is like the Louvre Museum of Energy Settings. And what he's done is, this paper is published in the JRS, but depending on, he varied one parameter, the energy setting. And so depending on the level of energy that you're setting, you will get different amounts of OBL. And the way that we set the energy in SMILE. The methodology of setting the energy in SMILE is specific. There is a protocol for setting a specific laser to the right levels. And that's why somebody calls me, oh, what settings do you use? It's like, I'm not telling you, because my settings won't work in your laser. And if they do, it's random. There is a way at arriving at the perfect bubble pattern. And so the answer to your question, in short, is that because we understand how energy affects the smoothness of the cut, and because we understand the relationships between plasma threshold, OBL, lenticle regularity, visual recovery, and the spacing of the spots and the dynamic interaction between how easy it is or how difficult it is to separate an interface based on an OBL pattern. Because of all this knowledge that we've acquired, we can now teach SMILE surgeons to start SMILE perfectly at the beginning and not have problems with OBL, ever, because you start knowing all the rules. As opposed to what whoever asked that question, I know where he's coming from, because in the days of early femtosecond flaps, and perhaps now with older lasers, there can be problems with OBLs, and that's to do with, you know, instability of the femtosecond laser, which is inherent. Even the VisuMax has instability. We have to constantly adjust parameters to keep it perfect throughout the day between eyes. Sometimes I'll make an energy change, but greater fluctuation in femtosecond technology leads to, you know, sometimes difficult OBLs. I think that the last thing I would say about that is that dissection technique, as a, you know, having the skills of lamellar surgery and the instrumentation, is the way to get around the problems of OBL. So in my early femtosecond flap OBL days, I developed a technique for basically manually dissecting an interface with blunt dissection in an area that wasn't cut by the femto. But that's a skill, and you have to have that skill on board so that when you're presented with that situation, you can pull that skill in and use it. Just to say that that's really, you know, OBL is not a problem area in SMILE if you are adequately trained.
And when you encounter it, it may not lead to a reduced outcome if you've managed it during the procedure.
That's the point. And, you know, that's why in our textbook, we talk about routine retrieving the lenticle, routine management, and non-routine lenticle extraction. We don't talk about a complication, like a torn lenticle. That's not a complication. The complication would be you couldn't get the bit out and you left it in. That's a complication. But ripping a lenticule just means you now need to spend time taking the bit that you left in there out. And then it's not a problem. And the patient ends up with the same result the next day. Why would you call that a complication? Why would you call it a complication that I didn't manage to chop that nucleus when I thought I was ready to chop it? Oh, I had to go back and do a little more carving. Okay, now I can chop it. That's not a complication. It's an alteration of the plan that you had initially. And so I think that applies to pretty much any kind of surgery. Would you agree? I mean, you know.
I would, yes, absolutely.
The discussion and ultimate decision of SMILE versus LASIK is often very nuanced and involves plenty of art in addition to science. However, what are the one or two most important factors, if any, that would make a patient unquestionably better for SMILE over LASIK? What are one or two important factors for the other way around? Okay, great. That's a really good question. So, Michael, I mentioned the dry eye. So if someone is has no cataract, they're 53, they're female, perimenopausal, meibomian gland dysfunction starting to kick up, kind of toxic tears, work on their tear film, optimize them as best as possible. Still a little bit of SPK, little notch on the lower lid there from chronic blepharitis. Tolerates monovision. Let's do SMILE. It's just going to be better for you. You'll have a much smoother and more comfortable visual recovery. You're a candidate for monovision. Monovision using Dan Dury's blended vision concept of using -125, which gives you practically all the reading you need, certainly intermediate and all the distance, and it's continuous. And with last week's talk, I was pinned to that 1 hour fireside chat by Dan. I was literally, I was like, I felt like I'd smoke a joint. I was like totally euphoric during that talk. It was like listening to a concert. So, you know, dry eye is one of those areas where you might want to be saying, you know, this is not a good idea to do LASIK here. Okay, so maybe that answers one. Optics is another. So depending on corneal thickness constraints and level of myopia to be treated, you may be able to do a larger optical zone with SMILE than you can with LASIK, because you don't have a flap where you're losing all that tissue to the flap. So there's another reason why SMILE would be the preferred treatment for that patient. Let's say someone's an Olympic Taekwondo expert and they cannot take a day off. They're in the middle of training. No problem. We'll do SMILE on you because you can do your Taekwondo tomorrow. Nothing's going to happen. There are no moving parts on SMILE the next day. And I'm certainly, you know, whereas a lot of people say, oh, you got to do PRK. No, if you're going to compare PRK to SMILE, you're going to lose, because PRK has a much higher chance of inducing recurrent erosion syndrome in that patient that gets hit in the eye than SMILE. So no way, Jose, forget about the long, you know, recovery of SMILE is way better for professional sportsmen with contact sports. So there are some examples. When would I do LASIK rather than SMILE? Well, Presbyon is the quintessential example in my practice. That's why 25% of our myopes still get LASIK, because about half of my practice is Presbyon, is presbyopic laser eye surgery. I don't take the clear lens out. I start by doing laser eye surgery, and I use depth of field modulation with spherical aberration. Maybe that should be a sort of fireside chat one day. But essentially, there are cases where I take advantage of the more complex ablation profiles that I can achieve with an excimer laser. And so that also there, to give you more examples on the LASIK side, is topography guided. Now, I know that some companies are talking about topography guided in every single eye. I posted, it was exhausting to write the post on the RSA server. Guy, I don't know if you can pull that up and retweet it to the group. But I wrote a very, very clear, concise argument against topography-guided treatments in all eyes. I do believe in it, and I do use it, but I use it when it's appropriate. And so there are cases where someone will have coma or a discernible higher order aberration that is not keratoconic, proven by epithelial mapping, and I will proceed to topography-guided. That patient would not be best served by a SMILE procedure, which wouldn't change their asymmetry. So as you can see, there are reasons for choosing procedures. I have an online lecture. I could ask Lisa to disseminate the link so I don't waste time looking for it now. But in fact, I recorded this again this week at another forum. That might be the best one, where I go through all of the procedures: PRK, trans-PRK, topography-guided, wavefront guided, SMILE, and ICL, all of the procedures. And I say, here's when I use this, here's when I use this. This is why this is not for every eye. This is why this is not for every eye. And at the end, I break the code and I tell you how many percentage of eyes I do of each procedure in my practice. So I hope that's a sort of comprehensive answer to your question.
I think that's great. That'd be awesome to get a copy of that to take a look at for a more in-depth answer. But otherwise, I think we're out of time for today. Again, very sincere thank you to Dan Reinstein. This was excellent. Excellent. I know I'm personally taking a handful of things that I'm already incorporating in my OR on Tuesday. So this is great. I'll point everybody's attention to the chat. This link will also come out in an email, but it's just the assessment for today's lecture. Go ahead and fill that out. If you fill them all out, you can get a certificate of completion. And otherwise, thanks again for joining us or tuning in, watching this lecture as a recording. We definitely appreciate it. We hope that you enjoyed this. And our next lecture, number 9, will be March 2nd, when we actually have Helen Wu talking about some complication management of corneal refractive surgery. So thanks, everybody, and have a good one.
Thanks, everybody. Dan, wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.